back to the NSP. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. This episode is really a conversation between two friends who happen to be retired Army officers. I first met Christian Lillington at the Royal Military College of Canada in 1994. Our relationship started with a slightly ill-intentioned wrestling match at a hockey game, but has improved significantly since then. Christian served as an armoured officer and deployed to Africa and 2 times to Afghanistan. He concluded his career as the commanding officer and base commander of the Army Training Centre in Meaford, Ontario. Christian has been open about living with complex PTSD, which he chronicles in his amazing memoir, Parade State Zero. We covered lots of ground in this discussion, from mental health and addictions, veterans affairs, the military family, and transition. This is the perfect conversation to highlight many of the challenges our veterans and their families face on a daily basis. Without further ado, here's my discussion with Christian Lillington. Christian, welcome to the Northern Sentinels podcast, my friend. Great to have you on the show.
Chris, it's an honor to be here. I know this is a long-awaited
It is.
meeting, and it's something I feel like I've been avoiding you, like a high school date that went wrong or something. But no, I'm honored to be here. It's kind of funny that we meet in sort of neutral ground in where your daughter goes to university. So it's just really cool to meet up finally.
Did you have any bad high school dates?
We'll save that for the next podcast.
Yeah, thanks for coming down and meeting us down here in Waterloo. And I definitely give a thanks again to Communitech for allowing me to squat and steal their one of their facilities here. So yours and Sheldon Fernandez were recorded down here in Kitchener, Waterloo in the Communitech Hub. So thanks to the team for facilitating this once again. Unlike a lot of guests, I know a fair bit about you. We've been friends for a while, and not only been friends for a while, but I was honored to be able to do a first read of your book. So I got a really detailed understanding of your life, and so I think that's going to provide some unique color on the podcast. The other thing I think that's really important is that this is going to be one of 3 podcasts that is part of the Remembrance Day package that I put out.
That's excellent. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, because I really want to focus on a number of veterans issues and went out and found some different veterans that I thought had some important things to say and could really help add to conversation on a number of fronts. Okay, so with all that said, Cape Breton.
Yes,
you've heard the podcast before. You know the deal. It's always origin story up front. And for those who haven't read Christian's book, Parade State Zero, I mean, there's a really good roll up of his childhood in there, which is an awesome read. And as someone who'd known him since I think we probably met in like 95, it was really great to get a chance to read something so honest and raw about your history. So I know there's not going to be any struggles with you in terms of like knowing your history and your background and telling that story, because you've done it a lot of times. But maybe we start with the origins of the family, whether it be before your mom and dad, your grandparents. Like, where do the Lillington clan and mom's side come from?
Well, yeah, it's kind of both my mom and dad come from very different backgrounds, to be honest, Chris. But having grown up in Cape Breton and in rural Cape Breton, so the northern tip in a fishing village called Neil's Harbor, a lot of the ties that my family name, the Lillington name, come from like just Newfoundland, and then past Newfoundland, it would have been over in Great Britain. I mean, it's a Welsh name, but certainly growing up with my knowing that my grandfather was a fisherman, his father was a fisherman. My dad broke the mold in a very large family because he was the youngest and worked for Parks Canada for the majority of his life until he retired after like a long service. Kind of almost like in the military, we talk about, commissioning from the ranks, kind of working your way up. He kind of started out, I think, painting numbers on stumps for campsites, and he ended up being almost in charge of logistics for all of Cape Breton, including Louisburg and Shetty Camp. So worked really, really hard his whole life. But for me, it was very much the fishing vibe of the community. Everyone pretty much fished or supported fishing. And it's very quiet during the winter months, very very little activity, and people kind of, I get a kick out of, how I've, in my adult years, what I expect for sort of resources for things like groceries and whatnot. And then I realized that I grew up in a town where we had one grocery store and had to drive 2 hours just to get anything significant like a turkey or anything like that. So it's just humble beginnings. I'm very proud of where I grew up. I grew up as a young kid who I would never let my children do what I used to do growing up, which is play on the water's edge and look for like broken, lobster traps and buoys and whatnot. But I certainly know that it shaped who I was. I spent a lot of time in the woods as a kid. And those are the kind of things that in retirement I've gone back to doing, quite honestly, because they bring me so much peace. It's almost like a familiar feeling, just to be, I call it a bird watching, even when I'm hunting, because that way there's no expectations from anybody in my life, me included. But I grew up in a large family, kind of a melting pot family. I had 2 brothers. And then I ended up having 3 stepsisters. And then one of my stepsister had a son who kind of was like an adopted brother. So kind of a different dynamic that way, but, certainly 2 good families, different sort of, priorities from both my mom and dad. Like my dad was very much, wanted us to be athletic and, do well and, not be socially inept. And mom was very much focused on academics and discipline and chores and family community type things, I call them. So the way I describe it to my children now, it's like being part of a community and a family. It's like being a good roommate. It starts when you're a kid. And so that's the kind of things that I don't regret. Certainly growing up, I was given a lot of hard lessons about, how to be successful, was really given a lot of, a push to have a good work ethic at a very, very young age. Like I remember having a full-time job at like maybe 12 or 13 and I never stopped, and that's just, I think that kind of like competitive nature was, and I talk about it in the book, like you mentioned, where it's what drove me to eventually the military. And then within the military, sort of how I kind of, how I grew as a leader was very much started early in my life, within, and not just within the high school system, just with everything in general, like within the community. I just think that I grew up in a strong community where, they say it takes a village. Well, I literally grew up in a place where I'd go door to door and it'd be like one aunt's house to, a cousin's house. And everyone was always open about, giving you free cookies and no, take these lobsters back to your father or whatever. It was just a very open and safe environment to grow up. And
okay. So when you talk about success and you talk about, and I'll just say expectations, but how is success defined for you? Because I think today, there's for those of us who serve with General Walt, right? We all know the expression, declare yourself a success early, right? So you can define your success, but it's not that black and white in the 70s and 80s, right? So what was the expectation of success for you then?
Well, I think for me when I was younger, and I think I'll start there because I think it's shifted over time, honestly, Chris. And I think it's fair for us to say that even now in retirement, our view of success or even, like meeting life goals shifts so much more rapidly because, well, life is not necessarily at the beginning anymore. But when I was young, certainly I wanted to get off the island as fast as I could and be as successful as I possibly could. But one of the stories I like to tell is that I was second youngest of my family, and I had 2 sisters or stepsisters, but sisters nonetheless, and a brother go to university ahead of me, really not having an idea of what they wanted to do. And they've all landed on their feet clearly as adults. And I thought to myself, and that's why the military played a role for me, because I was ready to join, whether it was through the officer or the NCM route, regardless. It just worked out that I ended up going the same route that you went with it, the ROTP program at the Royal Military College of Canada. But for me, I think that was success in the sense that I was able to sort of get out, really prove myself. But I would say after my first experience, like first year of RMC and moving forward, I think those measures of success, I had to be a little bit more calculated with. And I don't think I did a good job at I've always been really hard on myself. I don't think that's a surprise to people like yourself who know me. And so I would say I would always put them just a little bit too far out of reach, and I would have a problem with my own motivation to, and therefore the self-loathing, all those kind of things that, I think kind of gets ingrained in us as young officers. So that's why I say it would shift as we moved along, because even how we declared success, as young captains or as senior captains on the cusp of becoming a major, field grade officer, all that kind of business, becoming an officer commanding, like every one of those things. And then you throw in there things that we talk about a lot, like opportunity within the military, whether that's having the opportunity to be on a course or a program or a tour, which is kind of a sensitive issue to a lot of people, because as we've discussed, and I think we all agree, it is kind of a right time, right place military, vice right person, right tour kind of military.
Yeah.
And I think that persists even today, except, there's always forced generation issues, which is a whole different rabbit hole. But I know that even in my current, state of retirement and trying to help various veteran initiatives, including managing my own, that my measures of success are almost daily set for me. Vice having sort of a long range, I used to tell people as a career manager, have a next year plan, a 3 and a 5, and maybe even a 10-year plan, knowing that, look, the last 2 you make, the ones that are longer range, you have very little control over. And it's, but I think I shape my days and weeks now, just because that's what works for my mental health. I think it's what works best for my family, my wife, Kelly, all of our children, et cetera. So it's a great question, because I think it's something that shifts with over time, whether we want it to or not.
Yeah, it's funny. I really resonate with the talking about your siblings that went to university and maybe didn't really know what they were doing or what they wanted to do. I can distinctly remember. So it was June. Grade 13 in Ontario. It was June, and I had not heard from the military yet. So I think I'd gotten into a couple of programs in Ontario universities, none of which I think were really that interesting to me. I had agreed. I was in the Army Cadets. I had already agreed to go up to Whitehorse to the cadet camp there and do a job up there for the summer, which I thought would be pretty cool. But maybe it was because we didn't have you didn't have the internet, you didn't have ready access to the wealth of humanities knowledge. Like yeah. I really, in hindsight, I really had no idea where I was going. It was a blessing at the 11th hour I got into the military and then got into the sausage machine, because at least it gave me a direction, and at least it gave me some structure. Not that I was craving structure, because I had lots of it from the Army Cadets, but still, it put me on a path that I think was really useful, because it eliminated a lot of that uncertainty and those decisions, that decision making at an early age when I probably needed less maneuver room than I had. So yeah, that resonates with me for sure. Now, was there anything that would have kept you? Said you wanted to get out of Cape Breton. Is there anything that would have kept you in Cape Breton, kept you on the island?
I don't think so. I definitely was going to make my next bound. I mean, I was interested in policing as much as I was interested in the military. Sort of anything that was sort of suit my sort of high. I had a very high octane type mindset there. Like that would be the days where I'd get up at like 5 a.m. and run like for 15 kilometers before school, and like I was really intent on being successful in something. I think it was fortuitous for the military to have lined up for me. Like a lot of people, I wanted to be a pilot. It was a Top Gun era, and I went to aircrew in Toronto back in the day where it was very much analog. I understand that it's improved significantly since, and I was land sea sent home because I couldn't level the simulator. But I also had like mono or something at the time, and could barely like even keep my eyes open. So that was a bit of a sting, because that was the first time actually in my life I'd actually failed. Ever. And it was at the hands of the military during a grade 11 trip to Toronto on my own, which is one of the first times I ever left the island, certainly on my own. And it was one of those insanely awkward 3 or 4 days in what is now it's been sold, but it was Downs View at the time. And I just remember thinking, this is way too hard, the military, not knowing that, years later that, everyone kind of has a fit, and I think I was in the right spot to have eventually ended up in the Army. I think it was a good fit for me, to be fair.
What did that Can you remember what that failure felt like in terms of when
Well,
it hit you that, hey, you're not going to be the next Maverick?
Well, I think because I was very successful within my sort of, small community where I was in high school and I was the top of my class academically, those kind of things, student council president, captain this, captain that. For me, it was not knowing what to tell people when I got home about how it went
Right.
and how to not lie, but not necessarily eat a bunch of crow about something they may not understand in the end anyway.
Right.
So I think the fact that right away the recruiting center were keen enough to have had like my option 2 lined up and said, offer standstill. I just kind of said, no, I chose this over that, which in effect was chose by default. Right. But it was an era where, there was still a draw on numbers for the combat arms. They needed people. And for me, I knew nothing about it. I think I watched a 20-minute video of, like Centurion tanks, like tanks that weren't even in service at the time. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. I'll get my head around that. But, years later, it was way more exciting, obviously, when I started doing my training. But yeah, it's kind of funny when we think back about those moments, because I think it was a defining moment. Having done the Veterans Transition Network, which is a program for veterans supported by Veterans Affairs. It's a great program. It's for mental health, and it kind of has a bit of a misleading name. So if you look into it, you'll see sort of the value. But one of the things they have you do during that program is a timeline of your life from like your first earliest memory until to the present day. And all you do is you go along, and I'm a very visual person, so mine's like a linear, almost like a tree with branches. And as you start mapping sort of, I call them TSN turning points, like, the thing that kind of shifted you in a different direction, and obviously leaving home and what university you pick is a huge turning point. But as you go along and you start mapping out like, sports and then your relationships and then your hobbies, you realize just how many factors come into play at each stage of your life, and certainly once you have a family and have children, then you get into the whole posting game that we all had to do as officers, every 2 to 3 years. It really is a very difficult thing to manage. And I think we're given a lot of responsibility very early in life that we really don't grasp until we've made decisions that we might sometimes regret. And I know we talk a lot about not having mentors as officers, because that was something you looked to put in place when you were serving general within the Army. And I think it's still something that will always be a lacking. Like just not having someone like your Army dad to go, hey, like, or mom, and say, hey, what would you do about this, mom? Like, right. Because honestly, like, go take posting, gets promotion, don't take posting. Lauren stays in school for an extra 2 years with the same class.
Yeah.
And it's huge. And I think a lot of people do it because they think the military wants to make certain decisions. It's like, here's options A, B, and C, but A is always the most, has the most either, negative or positive, but the positive will outweigh the negative. And I think we do a lot of chasing of things that I think should be made easier for members. And I know it opened my eyes as a career manager, just how complex some people's lives are. Kids with special needs,
right?
Kids or spouses who have careers who are anchored in either an urban setting or to one province because it's a licensing thing. There's factors that people have to live their lives, and people's lives only get more complicated with time. And when you have children, then children have their factors of what they want to do, what sports they want to play, and So I think it's definitely something that I think a lot about. And sort of the experience I gained having helped people try to get to a better place with their military lives meets their own, family and passions and things like that. And I think we're too narrow-minded to think that people are always out for number one, because I think that families, and I think there's been a lot of studies, and you've certainly interviewed people that talk about family and military families, that, it is something that's forgotten very fast if the tempo is high. And it's the thing that people all will end up with in the last years of their lives and last chapter of their lives. It's generally focused heavy on family, but it's almost after the fact. Like we could have shaped it better along the way, and I think we just have to do better by our people. And I know there's a bunch of crazy rabbit holes we could jump down when it comes to what those issues are, but I just think if I was going to look at an issue or something I think will constantly be a problem that needs to be monitored within our communities, be it serving or retired members within the military, it is the impact of anything on a family, be it active service, mental health, exposure to trauma, traumatic events, you name it. And I just think it's a really complex problem. And I think that a lot of people like to put Band-Aids on it. I call them shiny poster type solutions that look good on a poster, but they're not deep. They don't have that depth of maintenance. They don't have like the continuation of education for, be it families, their children, et cetera. What resources are out there? We have like so many resources, but nothing's collated. Right? It's like a big wide web of useful things in small doses, but nothing in one central hub. And I hope to eventually be able to bridge that gap with my Warriors for Life website, but it's one of those things that needs a constant watering and feeding.
Yeah, it does.
It is a full-time job to be like a webmaster of, even if it's a hub for information. You get links to websites, other resources, inpatient programs, because there is a lot out there right now for veterans. Certainly in the United States and Canada, if you combine all the various initiatives, it can be staggering, but it's almost overwhelming to the point where they are very much becoming, regional vice, catering to a larger group. And that's why I mentioned things like, Veterans Transition Network, CanPraxis. There are a lot of various programs that do service coast to coast, all veterans and serving members. And I think they're starting to add elements to those programs, i.e. for spouses and families, that speak to sort of a deeper issue. Obviously, you want to stabilize a member who's suffering, either be it from chronic pain, from physical injuries and or mental health injuries. First, it's like the whole put your mask on in case of an airplane disaster so you can help other people. You regulate yourself first. But once that veteran's been sort of taken care of, I think the next deep dive has to be their families, especially their children. I mean, the majority of my children have been getting therapy for well over 5 years now. And I think I can see the difference in their ability to manage their own health, let alone, communicate and connect with myself. But some of my children aren't. And, they're men. It's the boys in the family that refuse it. All 4 girls are getting it. And I can see, like Kelly and I can see the difference and just how the girls manage their general stress day to day, their own anxieties, their own fears. Whereas the boys they just don't see it as being acceptable, which means to me, like in a societal type view of things, it's still a bad thing to have a mental health problem, right, or struggle with, general anxiety, or, having OCD-like tendencies because you check things a lot because it's like an insecurity. Like it's still a label, and it's an unfortunate reality. Like I wear my labels proudly, but it's only because I realize that in doing so, it should help people. Right. It should help people feel less awkward about saying, yeah, man, I was depressed last week too. I've had friends, being, recently just come out of like a 3-year depression and get the help they needed and just, feel that weight lifted. And that's, I've been fortunate to be given a lot of tools and have had a lot of really good professional help to get there myself. But it's still I'm still a work in progress, and it's still a day-to-day affair. Right.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Maybe for the listener that's not as sort of au fait with military things. So Christian's talking about career management, and in the military, we actually manage the military members at the institutional level. So there is, down at the military unit level, sort of at the workplace, there's definitely a role there, but a lot of it's actually done at the institutional level. So when you have people who fill these roles, they actually see the life and times of a significant number of people in managing that, performing that HR function. So that's what Christian's talking about when he's had that opportunity while in service to be a career manager and see how service impacts different people in so many different ways. Maybe let's talk a little bit about your initial impressions of the military. So whether that be your time at military college, it could be it could be basic training, could be your first sort of actual Army training. I mean, what, coming out of small town Cape Breton, I mean, was it what you hoped for? Was it what you needed? How did that?
That's a really good question, because I feel like, it's no secret. I think once you sort of, whether we read the book or we talk, you'll understand that I didn't have the normal path. So my first summer wasn't actually basic training. It was a program at Royal Roads called Academic Bridging. So I kind of did things in sort of a delayed pace. So it actually made things kind of easier because after you've done recruit term, like it was done in 1993, and that's no comparison today. I'm not saying it was by any means acceptable, some of the things that we had to do in that 6-week period, but and then doing basic training the following summer after a full year of RMC it's almost laughable. And for what they're trying to achieve in basic training, which is to see you do a basic level small party task, which you do every morning at RMC essentially. Yeah. So and then therefore I had to do my second language training, which was still a thing then, at least formally for officer cadets. And then, so my phase 2 was in Gagetown was late. So what happened to me is I'd finished and graduated from RMC in 1997. And then did my phase 3, but had to wait a full year because we hadn't yet program officer training outside of that sort of summer cycle. That started sort of when I became an instructor, sort of in the early 2000s.
So did you not have a cohort then because of that sort of weird cycle?
Because it was such a smattering of different occupational trades within the military. I was one of 3 armoured officers that would have been caught in that cycle. So yes, we would have been delayed, but those my 2 peers were unsuccessful in phase 3 and moved off to a different base for a different occupation. So I guess the long and short of it is that one of the things I do credit to my success as a cavalry officer or an armored officer, reconnaissance or tank was the fact that I did a lot of on-the-job training as an unqualified officer. So having that humble pie every day of not being qualified, so therefore not leading, but being expected to lead, unqualified, so smart enough to not, hurt yourself, but smart enough to sort of point people in the right direction. So I had a lot of good mentorship at the very lowest level from like the troopers that drive that are trying to tell me and make me understand how hard it is to hear radio orders and to react if it's last minute. Like so, giving me coaching on how to be a better crew commander. To to officers. My first OC was a gentleman by the name of Doug Claggett. And he was just really good at tactics, and I learned right away how important radio procedure was. I made ACP 125, which is like this historic radio manual, my Bible at night, so I could understand and be just really quick at relaying orders. And then once I became bilingual, I could do it in both languages. So I credit a lot of that success to just having to wait my time to finish, the next step so that I could be qualified. And I think that applied to me as a troop leader when I got the Valcartier, despite my linguistic inability then, because I went there very much as an Anglo from Cape Breton with yes, no toaster kind of, very, very little. I could swear very, very, very well because that's what you kind of learn at RMC. Back in the day, at least that's kind of was the threshold for, whatever it was, the basic qualification for, I know they've upped that.
I think it was then. 2s, right? It's
back
when we used to
it was
have
numbers.
It was numbers, not letters.
But, having been at Valcartier, it turned me into a fluently bilingual person, which, helped my leadership style and my ability to instruct later on. So, so I think my first impressions, that things were always harder at the onset, but when you looked back at them, it was always something you wish you'd had have put more of an effort into. And I don't know how to qualify that, only that I know, like I said, because I did everything delayed, for example, when I did my phase 4, which is troop leading, and then it was tank, was the occupational specification. So that was the standard. There was 12 of us, and I just wanted to crush it, and I wanted to do my best. But and I had actually a peer of mine wasn't really a peer then, but he outranked me. But he, I knew him on a personal level, and he just was smart enough to at least point out that wasn't quite, polished enough when it came to those basic level requirements. So I finished second on that course, and I remember it burned a hole in my head because I was a very competitive person, and I thought this was going to be the thing that would, launch me into like greatness, when we all know that that's all, smoke and mirrors in the end, right? Yeah. I look at like our serving general officers now and the folks that like we all know, and I won't name drop, but, and I'm proud of, the vast majority of them, quite honestly. But, as officer cadets, those weren't all the people that stood out and had the cross bats and the crazy crowns and all those sort of fancy badges at RMC. They were the folks that just kind of plowed through the middle. But they had such good mindsets that they became amazing leaders because they could lead and follow, right? It wasn't just always about leading. And that's kind of what I learned, and being delayed in all my phase training was I did have to become like, that Mr. Bloggins that had to go, like do his shift on radio at like 4 a.m. in the Arctic, because that's when you put second lieutenants on shift. So,
That's right.
and I don't blame him. And, like that kind of stuff. And it made me, stronger. I actually have very strong relationships as a retired, fella now with a lot of those troops I met, like, 30 years ago, that helped guide me, give me nicknames like Arctic Char and Arctic Cat, because, I used to steal the snowmobiles when they'd get off them, but then I'd cut myself on fire and almost, had to be put out by a sergeant who just recently passed. God may he rest in peace, Rick McMillan. He saved my life in the Arctic, that guy, because I was just trying to be with the OC out there, and those like improvised shelters, like in minus like 70 or something.
Oh yeah.
Hexamine tablets didn't work in my favor that night, but
you mentioned mentors earlier here, and it's not a subject that we've covered too much in the podcast. A few people we've had a chance to talk about, but I'm wondering, maybe in that early stage of your career, that forming stage of when you're in the Army, are there people that stand out as having, whether it be like you just talked about, Doug Claggett?
Doug, yeah.
Yeah, you just talked about Doug as being sort of that technical, tactical kind of providing that mentoring. But the people who stand out in that regard, either as that, whether it be because they were teaching you skills, or maybe even on the compassion side of like having a little bit of a step back and saying, okay, I'm going to help this young fellow along.
In retrospect, I think when I was a young subaltern, and I think the captain rank is kind of included in there, but it's also, as you get along as a captain and you start to morph into this, field grade officer and then get promoted. But what I'm trying to say is I think I lacked a really good mentor early on as a captain. And I think I wanted one, but maybe now that I look back on the way I was, no one probably could have filled that role, because I don't think I would have listened to much of what they said. Because if they had told me I need to slow down, like all the things that I've been briefed on in every annual report interview for my entire life, does not work well with others, and I say that because it was more of I'd like to think it's assertive, but I know I borderline on aggressive a lot, and just wanting to get things done and be the best. I think if I had a mentor who didn't make my environment more charged competitively, because that's what happened, at least in Balcarce in the years I was a subaltern, is that everything was a competition. And therefore you're constantly comparing yourself to your peers, which is completely destructive. I mean, even socially, comparing yourself to your peers, i.e. what girlfriend you have, and if you have children yet, or should you, and like, it's an absolute ridiculous environment. I don't know if anyone could have calmed me down of trying just to get through that to my first tour, and then onward to become, like a battle captain and things that you want to do. So back with the troops, knowing that we're on these cycles where we spend very little time in a regiment, most of it in the institution. But knowing that your time spent with troops is the most precious you get. And I will never change that opinion. Like my two highlights, and I think it's probably very similar for you, even though you made it well ahead in your career with respect to leadership, would be when you were an OC and when you were a CO. I mean, and those are, for me, officer commanding and commanding officer, where, having that ability to actually help people, to shape training, to shape mindsets, to develop your subordinate officers, to have that connectivity with people and communities. Like when I was in Meaford, I had that opportunity to be like a local ambassador for the military, because it's very much the only thing up there. Next to Borden. So it is a career that I definitely don't regret looking back. But if I could have, when I came into sort of my younger years as a major rather, I was fortunate to work for a gentleman who we both worked for, named Lowell Thomas, who really helped toughen me up to some of the realities in the institution. I very much a naive, younger major before I became an OC, and had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan as a result of his influence, in the sense that like he saw that I think he felt that I should have had that role, and then therefore I worked towards it, and it came to fruition. But as I got through that phase, because General Thomas went a different route, and I went back to the regiment, I would say that in the last years of my career, the biggest and most influential mentor I had is the current Vice Chief of Defense Staff, Steve Kelsey, an absolute brilliant leader. I actually learned how to manage people properly watching him manage people. And he was the corps director at the time. So a lot of politics, a lot of things changing within the military, a lot of issues with the closing of Afghanistan. And we, spread our wings into other operational venues. Just a brilliant person to follow. And I know we've both had experience with General Kelsey. Just an absolute gem of a person and a role model as a family man, a role model as a leader. Humility he practices it daily. And I would say there's not a lot of our senior leadership, I mean, maybe up until recently, that understood how important that was, that level of humility and just not always having the answers, but being able to lean on the team, And he was always a team guy. So I'm very happy to see him where he is now.
Yes, I think what you said in terms of just being a good person, and I think that's what General Steve's superpower is his foundation is just being a good human, and then you can build any house off that.
Absolutely,
and I agree. I think we're incredibly fortunate to have him as the second in command of our military. It's interesting you talk about competitiveness in the military. The more I've thought about this over the years, one of the things that sort of rolled around in my head is that the competition, my experience was not real in a lot of ways, right? There's this sense of competition being the best team's going to win, the best person's going to win based on a number of metrics, but ultimately it is a meritocracy is what you think. And I don't want to say that it's not, but there is an element of things are preordained a lot of times.
The deep select, I call it.
Yeah, and I had this conversation with the other day. Like I can probably point to a moment when I was a lieutenant when I think that I was put on a certain track. And when I reflected on it, I went, after that point, there was the occasional person that would actually give me some useful feedback, like that didn't go well, develop yourself, work on this. So I think a guy like Andre Corbel was someone who is a CO who was, very clear at trying to help me develop. A guy named Dana Woodworth, but there were few and far between who were very sort of direct of saying, like, this is how you need to get better. So I guess my point about the competition is that I almost feel like people are put on these tracks at an early stage of their career, at least in the officer ranks, and trying to get off that track, right, onto another track or vice versa, right? It seems to be really difficult. Really difficult.
So it's kind of funny because I have a different experience with that. I was fighting to get on a track, or that's the way I felt. Right? Like I never felt accepted, right? I always felt like, I used to call I was one of a couple Anglophones within the regiment, and we really struggled initially with language, French. And we used to call ourselves Hell's Anglos because no one would talk to us, right? and you lose your parking spot to the troops because you couldn't tell them not to park there, right? Like, I was a troop leader yesterday, but today I'm in general parking, which apparently is a big deal when you're an officer, is having your own parking spot, which is ridiculous anyway. But I felt like, I'm listening to you talk, and I felt like I was fighting to get on a track. And I think people are telling me, don't fight so hard. Like, I think that was the message of my early mentors, is that you're fighting too hard. Like, you are going the way you need to go, but it's like you're fighting to do the same thing we were going to do for you anyway, right? Like, you're going to get that tour. You're going to go off and be an instructor, which is your first regiment, extra regimental employment. Yeah, sorry, struggling with that one because I want to speak in acronyms, and I know all the listenership doesn't speak in military acronyms. So, but then later, once I saw that, a bit more exposed to sort of the institutional sort of path for most folks, and was able to sort of lay it out, and I hate to go back to always this, job I did for 2 years, but it's shaped the way I made me understand the center, as people used to refer to it, and the institution, and sort of the actual path for, a young man or woman who join at 18 and expect to retire at 40, X years, or, into their 50s if they, make a long run at a career. And I don't think people, like I've had a couple of officers in my time and very few troops, but a couple have that clear vision of where they started and where they would end up. Most people, it's like a a tour to tour, year to year, course to course, deployment to deployment kind of thing. Right. And I don't know. I'm not saying that we should have people with these paths that they can say, hey, I'm supposed to be here now. I don't think that's even possible. I think that we have to be smarter at realizing not everyone has the same path to get to this, that same end state, whether it's to be, like, for example, the junior officer world. There's so many jobs out there for, young men and women who are junior officers in their, be it specific to what they've trained in or, in general. But, why do we weigh things more heavily? Like everything wants to be weighted like the heaviest, put the best people in recruiting, put the best people with our, ill and injured. Let's put the best people in our ops center. Let's put the best. Well, you know what? We are an organization that represents a demographic, which is not all the best people. Like we have people who are average, we have people who struggle to be average, and we have a lot of people who are excellent. But in the end, we are, we're a mixed bag, and it's like that's why I say, like we're the strangest village in Canada you'll find is walking on any base, because you have someone talk to you in Newfoundlandese and another person not acknowledging what you said because they didn't understand a word, because they come from like BC, and then you have people from Ontario who I can put all kinds of stereotypes out there, but I guess my point is it really is a mixed bag. There tend to be a lot more people in the past from rural areas. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it depends if you're talking about reserve or rank force.
Right.
Because the only thing I feel is diverse in our military are our reserves. So, and that's just, it's just not a men and women thing. I'm talking about diversity in general. So, right. Yeah, the mentor thing it's something I'm not circling back to that because I know it's something that was very passionate in your heart in your last years of service before retiring, is that it's still a missed opportunity, I think. And I think if you make it too it can't be sort of too small that it becomes controlled, i.e. like if it's just within one corps, it's a failed concept because there's nepotism, and then competition will grow regardless if it's just general, mentorship and advice giving. I think it has to be like what you were looking at, more of a sort of broader program where you can, it's more transparent, and I wouldn't say it always has to be fair. Life isn't fair, but it should be as easy to access for one person as the next. Yeah. And someone might struggle early, but not struggle later in their career. And it might be because they're, trying to get that perfect, bilingual, code on their NPR so they can get the posting of their dreams when, we, probably don't want to go down the rabbit hole of how important bilingualism is or isn't to the military. But, those are the things people struggle with, and they overpressurize their own lives because that's what the system says they need to have.
Yeah, I think you've raised a great point about, the feeling of being put on these tracks, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. And I think as I got further along in my career, the advice I would give to people was always just make sure that you're making decisions for the right reasons, for things that are important to you. Right. Because what happens then is if you have this vision of a certain outcome and that outcome doesn't get realized, well, then you're not that put out because you made a decision based on what you wanted to do. Right. The type of work, the location, like whatever that might look like to you personally, you do your best work and whatever happens, happens. Whereas if you're constantly doing something because you think this is going to get you the thing that you want, the outcome you want, and that outcome doesn't materialize, well, then you become probably angry,
jaded, bitter. Right. There's resentment that grows in your
life's
heart.
Not fair, whatever it is. So, yeah, I think but a lot of that is not evident. It doesn't matter about the military or not. I think we all have this with our children, having conversations with them, with other young people. And this isn't something that's just self-evident. I used to say it at RMC, and Christian came and briefed at RMC a couple of times, and it was awesome. And I used to say to the officer cadets there, as they're sort of looking at me with this jaundiced eye of like, what does this guy know? Fair comment. But I'm not any smarter than anybody in this room. I've just taken the test more often, right? So there's so many things, as we all know, that just sort of repeat themselves. You can quickly make a decision based off experience. Right. Well, when you're 19, you maybe have written the test once. When you're 50 and you've written it, 30 or 40 times, like I've seen this question before. I might not get full marks on this, but I'm going to get good enough mark to carry on. So, I think that's the importance of mentors is not to sort of tell people what to do, but to just sort of help them maybe understand a little bit better how to manage situations that aren't always self-evident until they have enough sets and reps under their belt.
Yeah, I would even go as far as saying there's a concept. I have a couple of my children have special needs, and one of my daughters medically complex. And one of her specialists tried to talk to me at one point about the concept of the external brain. And if you think about it, when we're trained, qualified officers, generally speaking, people join when they're 18, they do 4 years of schooling, when they're 22 or 23, they'll graduate, they'll have finished a military training, they'll be what we call OFP or operational functional point. They're still only 23. Their brain is not even developed. The logic center in our brain develops between 25 and 27. I know there's people, specialists that will say might start in women when they're 25, but for men, it's generally as you're pushing 30. Say like I'm a slow learner. I'm pretty sure mine's still closing, but when you think about, we charge and equip all of our leadership with a lot of training, but you can't form their brains for them. So you're really a lot. That's why I think templated training is sometimes like drills and skills. Like we make fun of doing drill because it's so archaic, like foot drill. But when we think about what that is doing, it's that muscle memory. Pardon me. That we have to certain things. Like when we say frag out, people jump and hit the ground. Like you generally don't joke about stuff like that. Or the color of the flags on a range. Like it's a visual gas. All those things you do to sort of instinctivize the way people should react. Doesn't mean they're all going to react that way. Like I've seen people button themselves in an armored vehicle when being in contact in Afghanistan because that was their instinct. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That's because, either they didn't do enough training or the training is good to a certain point. And then there's that whole how people react in when it's real. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting thing to think about.
External brain.
Yeah. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't leave, 24, 25-year-old young platoon troop leader commanders with decision-making powers. But I understand why, as officer commanding, we're generally in our young, mid-30s, say, 30. I was 30 when I was an OC. But, I guess the point being is that you really have to keep an eye on that sort of ego. You have to keep an eye on the rash decision-making, and you hope they have sort of, second in commands as, senior soldiers that have that experiential and maturity sort of aspect to go, yeah, I hear where you're coming from, ma'am or sir, or whatever the case is. But, the last time we ran a range, it's kind of just works with 10 people at the firing point, not 75, just so we can do it in an hour kind of deal. Right. I'm just exaggerating to make the point is that it's that ambition and being management and managing that ambition for young people. I look at my oldest is 23 years old. Kelly's oldest is 20. I mean, we have 20-year-old children in our midst, but I'm not expecting them to make perfect decisions for another decade, honestly. I mean, it would be unfair for them to not make mistakes. And I think that's the other thing, too, in the military. We don't let people make mistakes because everything is almost punishable by death, right? Like we're terrified to be charged. We're terrified to do extra duties and be embarrassed. There's a whole sort of, gamut of corrections that, have changed over time. And some of them are ridiculous, like forcing a person to sit for 5 hours and drink wine and not use the washroom is like torture. But I stand by those extra duties in January. They were 14 of the best days I've ever had in the brigade commander's office in Valcarce.
That's in reference to mess dinners, I'm sure.
No, absolutely. But I guess the point being is I just think we need to do a better job, like you say, of having a steady hand on those young, troops and leaders as they kind of get to the point where they can make decisions knowing all the factors with all the training that they should have, be it tactical or otherwise. And, I always thought that we like to train people. We don't do a lot of mentoring or continuation of that training.
I agree.
And the skill fade's insane because we have so much to know all the time, right? Your first tour in Ottawa, like just the acronyms of where people live, let alone the floor and cubicle they work in, it's like real map training. Like it's urban map training. Like go to this building, find this person. You're going to sit on this working group that's going to decide, UAVs in the military forever. Oh, that sounds like a lot of responsibility for a young major.
Yeah. You know what? I hadn't really thought about this, but there's tons of skill sets that fade very quickly. And to your point about how critical mentoring is, one of the things that doesn't fade is when you're teaching people to live their values, you're teaching them how to be a good person, you're trying to show them right from wrong. I mean, that stuff, that sticks. I found that tends to stick, and that tends to, again, be that foundation that you can build anything off of. So even if you've lost your drills about running an armored vehicle, crew commanding an armored vehicle, a LAV-3 turret, all the drills in there, you can get those back because it is something you're not doing every day. But the good person, the living your values, that's an everyday thing.
Absolutely.
And that's taught, if that's taught well at the start, examples are set, then that's a rock that is not going to be changed. And again, you can build anything off it.
Well, it's funny when you're a young officer, like my first time as a major in Kingston, I worked within a headquarters for, doctrine and training, and General Stu Beer was the commander then, and he would remember my name. That's all it took for me to know that guy's a human being. Like he had like thousands of people, as you know, work for him. And I'm like a staff officer within the Directorate of Army Training, worked for General Thomas at the time. And when I would take stuff, it was, how are you, Christian? Like I think he even knew my kids' names. And to me, I know that might sound so simple, but for me, it was just like, and I know he was a big family man person, but I think he set an example as a 2-star for me as a brand new field grade officer, that's the kind of stuff that sticks with me, at least. Now, sometimes it takes me a long time to realize that example that's being set for me, because I'd always be looking for that next bound, that next, blind corner right or left, but I would certainly be moving as fast as I could forward. And I do regret that level of ambition because, you don't appreciate things for what they are. And everyone always says, when you're in command and whatnot, enjoy every day because it will go by so fast. And it's true. It's absolutely 100% true. And, even the snow days, you regret those days, like we had a lot of snow days, but, also it's located on a hill that's rarely ever plowed. So, I think in general, I think it's, the ability for us to slow people down so that, take care of their wellness. Like how many in-service, mental health retreats are there? Like we do adventure training and there's things like that exist within the military to challenge and get, members to be, reset, refreshed. But like sending active general officers that we know are high stress, high stress all the time within, working the Ottawa bubble on mental health retreats that are professionally run, that are not linked to the military, that will actually properly assess their, from an executive point of view, their wellness. Because some people need, like, Jim Carrey used to say, he needed deep rest. That's how he got through his depression. Like literally needed to do nothing. And a lot of people aren't given that opportunity. And I think that the thought of it probably makes them scared because they just don't know what that would look like if they did slow down. Even though slowing them down and giving them a reset is probably better for the institution long-term than anything we could do. Because people make mistakes when they get tired. That's why we only have tours that are 7 months long in a combat environment. Like the Americans did. What happens to them, other nations, I shouldn't point out to the U.S. in particular, but that do longer tours. Generally more bad things happen within that, within that organization that don't involve the enemy,
Right.
Whether it be like inappropriate, fraternization or inappropriate, things, theft, just things happen. When troops get bored, things happen. And when people are deployed too long with their families or that reset, I think it makes for a cloudy mindset. Like I know that I was very nervous at the end of any one of my tours about having a negligent discharge just because I knew I was getting tired and I was going to do something different than I'd been doing it, like clockwork every day prior. Because we just get tired. And that's generally when most troops would have them. I'm like, you've been here for 7 months. You're like in your last week and you forgot how to clear a C6 on a mounted C6. Like it's just fatigue. It's like, anything in your life. It's just, it burns out.
It is a cultural challenge. I mean, I ran a bit of an experiment in my last job with my team. So I had, I don't know, a half dozen directors. And I said to them, I'm expecting each one of you to take a day off a month and do no work, like focus. So no, like military work. So work around your yard.
Leashed to a BlackBerry or whatever.
Like
mobile
spend time with your family, like whatever it looks like, don't do any work. And I think I kind of got a third. I got a third that went, yeah, okay, I like that idea. I got a third that said, I can't do that. like just we had back and forth numerous times, and I credit them with being open and honest for whatever the reasons. I got too much work to do. I can't. But really, the institution had gripped them to such a point where they were just so uncomfortable with it. And the other third, I heard nothing from, and I'm assuming that they probably then just went and ignored me and did whatever,
Right.
kept working. But that was really useful because when I retired, I recognized how important finding a way to deinstitutionalize was. And even now, 2 years later, as I'm, well, when this is recording, I haven't started a new job. As I'm about to start a new job, like I'm really mindful in the ramp up to this about, I lived this life for 30 years. It kind of looked like this. I just need to understand that that is not what I'm walking into. There's some great stuff I'm going to bring from that to add value, but I also have to be really careful about what this new thing is and it isn't.
Yeah, that's actually a good point and segue into like sort of the difficulties of transition and what you bring from your previous chapter, albeit a huge chapter for us with full careers. And it's no slight to people who have shorter careers. Sometimes I think they're smarter, but as we move, what do I transition into my, retired life, helping veteran organizations? What skill sets? Well, I thrive off structure, and I am, there's very few veterans that I don't meet now, whether they're struggling or not struggling, that structure is not one of the things that reinvigorates at least their ability to do a day-to-day type life, whether they're, like I joke with the kids about making their beds and, the importance of, dishes and, cycling laundry and all these silly little things, but, they might be nuances that make me feel good because it's order within the home, but it's also, I know, like it sets the expectations. Like my youngest child's 13, for what I expect out of her on a daily basis. And, and in the end though, like I always have these little quips with the kids, should I get like hit by a bus tomorrow? What would dad have said? And it's always the things I wish maybe people had said more often to me, that it's always about being a good person. In the end, like if you put your hand on your heart, you might be homeless, you might, not have X, Y, or Z, but if you know that you're being a good person, you're appreciating, you don't know everyone's story when you meet them, you don't know what they've been through, you don't know what they're going home to, for that matter. I think that, I think Kelly and I are, our kids have compassion, they have empathy. I think those are skill sets that, there's so much bullying out there nowadays. There's the cyberbullying and it's insanely unfair what we don't understand about what our kids are going through. And I know it's a whole another rabbit hole, but when you think about it, it was just like physical violence of when we were growing up. How uncomfortable was it in high school to watch someone, getting beat up? Well, now it's seeing someone mocked because they're, being on one of these platforms, Snapchat or all these other things, they're being, ridiculed or singled out, or I think it's an unfair thing. There's so many things I try to understand to the best of my ability to be a good parent. There's other things that just make my mind melt, so I try to stay away from them. And those aren't things we want to talk about today. But
we can talk about anything today.
Yeah. Well, I gotta. What? I'll tell you a couple of things I've struggled with since I retired, and I want to know sort of, not putting you in the spot, obviously, Chris, but
no, please.
I think there are things we need to sort of flesh out. Certainly, as I don't consider myself, when I say senior leadership, I retired as a light colonel, and I know you retired in the general world, but I think we had those same shaping type experiences in the latter part of our career where we had to deal with, hard issues and, uncomfortable situations. And so one of the things, I officially retired in 2019. The last couple of years, I was sort of finding my way with my mental health journey, with, great support from the transition center in Meaford and the people there like Jackie Sharon. And so I had, I had the benefit of knowing the people that were trying to help shape my retirement medically, because of my mental health injuries, et cetera. But, that was also the time when, and you were still serving, I believe. You were part of the whole implosion of the sort of Arbor report and sort of looking at the military from that perspective of sexual misconduct, et cetera. I still struggle with that concept, and I think it's probably harder for me now than it was even 7-8 months ago, because I think about my journey as an officer. And I'll elaborate on that in a second. The second reason why I find it hard to manage now is because my oldest stepdaughter, or my stepdaughter, Grace, she's recently enrolled in the military and is part of a sort of progressive co-op program and is a trained gunner now. But I just, even trying to mentor her when asked, what do you think of this? Or I realize just how much has changed, but also what hasn't changed. And that's kind of what bugs me the most. So it shouldn't be, I think, and certainly help guide and question and shape where I'm going with this. But, it shouldn't be an occupational hazard to be a woman in the military, period. And one of the things that's been very clear to me, like working with veterans, the majority of the people I work with on programs and whatnot have mental health struggles, which is usually a complex trauma of, various issues. And a lot of people like to think it's from a car accident or an explosion but a lot of it's institutional. And what I mean by institutional, it was, when they were, a young subaltern, I'll use in the officer world, on a ship or in a unit, et cetera, they were harassed or worse, right? They were, there was sexual assault, the perpetrator, moved off into their career and nothing happened to them. There's a lot of various, folks out that are managing these issues where their story is always going to be one where I think the term is like screaming into the void. Like it's just not heard. And people, don't want to believe the ugly that's out there. And I really, when it first sort of broke, and how people were reacting to it, and I kind of did, which I rarely do because I tend to be a bit impulsive. I try to step back and really analyze my level of association to the whole thing and how complicit I was. And then it drew me right back to my first, well, not even my first tour at the regiment, because as a troop leader, I did have a couple troops, female troopers come into my troop just as I was leaving, but more so as an instructor. Because I instructed at the armor school in Gagetown in an era where, I could give someone 100, like I could give them a 0. Like it wasn't qualified. It was a gut feel thing. And I remember being brought onto a course as an instructor to fail a female candidate that the regiment, quote unquote, wasn't ready to accept. And she didn't fail. She passed because my job wasn't to decide the politics of the regiment. It was to actually, in that instance, it was her tactical ability, married up with her ability to communicate and move, 4 tanks successfully within a squadron context. She did that. I got a hard tongue lashing on that day. I mean, they made it so that they could minimize her efforts and ability to be successful in the end somehow, but it wasn't by my hand. But did that mean that I was a hero then? No, it meant that I was sensing where my core was starting to view things when it came to that sort of gender issue. And certainly within the leadership part of it, you fast forward, and I kind of didn't think much about it because I always treated my students, whether they're officers or NCMs, equally. And I was really strict and I had high expectations. And I think, especially within the tactical world, there's things I wouldn't tolerate, especially if it was safety of the crew or et cetera. If it was live fire, obviously there's different rules with that. But I thought I was a pretty open-minded instructor in the sense that it didn't matter if they were, a man or a woman or whatever their background was. Now I think people might argue with me about that, if they knew me then, because I was so intense, but I think I was intensely fair. Now, when I look at the issues as I go through my life, different people I work with or organizations I was, in charge of, be it as an officer commanding in the squadron. When I deployed to Afghanistan with a reconnaissance squadron, I had all of my medics, less Carlos, were female. I didn't have any female crewmen or reconnaissance soldiers. But that was just the way the squadron was developed because it was one of the last generated squadrons in the regiment. And
right.
It was just the way it happened. But having said that, all of my soldiers were equals. And I thought that the female medics were because they were dismounted medics and they had to work within a crew, but also be dismounted. I thought they worked seamlessly within the patrol. It's a patrol-based fight then. It wasn't a squadron or even a troop level. It was all, 3-car patrol type issues.
How many people in a patrol?
So 12 to 15, depending on
Okay.
what. So it's like a 4-person per vehicle, sort of 3 vehicle, but we'd have augment with, if we had an engineer requirement, there'd be, an engineer det for
So it's still a pretty small team.
it's very small, intimate team. And I thought, they had, rules about, there'd be different latrines, but we're all pooping in the same bag and burning it, right? So it's just, they would afford more privacy and, because, a lot of the soldiers would get to the point where they just get behind a rock and you'd still see their head, they'd be talking to you and they'd be pooping because that's just, you kind of get used to that stuff. Yeah. But they kind of made an austere world very comfortable in a weird way. I mean, there's still scorpions everywhere and kangaroo rats and that kind of stuff to manage. But I just, going back to that issue of like trauma. So what I find unfair, knowing now that just the plethora of women who have served in the military, who have, become veterans, who have trauma that was, occurred because they were female, i.e. they were preyed on or they were minimalized in a role where they could have been, they would have flourished, be it leadership or otherwise. I just think that the whole like predatory sexualized environment we have in the military needs a full stop. And I know that we've sort of the institution is sort of moved in different directions to help sort some of these issues out. And I know that, the whole sort of pendulum as it would be of sort of how we manage this broader sort of issue is coming to sort of, to head when it comes to policies and whatnot. But I still think there is still a problem for one, those who are already been victims of sexual violence. And I know there was that huge class action lawsuit and, people are getting these marginal payments, but nothing ever replaces that level of distrust that gets created when someone is attacked in their own world, like in their own community, their own occupation, like the thing that we're trying to create, the very trust we try to create is just absolutely ruined by the actions. I would like to think of a few, but if it's only a few, then why are there so many people who've been victimized? Right. So it clearly is a mindset. And I won't say that, and I kind of initially was talking about, how I had this one student, I didn't fail her, et cetera. There's lots I did. And I think there was always a pressure for me to do that. Just like it would have been a pressure for me as a career manager, maybe to see certain officers not on the same level as others based on gender. And I absolutely I took serious issue with that. And again, a reason why I think it worked, I was probably a better neutral ground for people as a career manager than that what they were used to in the past, because it was just a matter of, honestly, fairness. Like it's just cards are not stacked in their favor. And I see that now that, again, looking back at, roles I played and whether I was like that myself. I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with how I manage those issues then. And when I say that, and I have a few pauses as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about as a commanding officer of a training establishment in Meaford. It was an infantry battle school for all intents and purposes, with a sort of junior leadership sort of nuance that takes place, as you know, in Petawawa. But we didn't successfully have a regular force female private pass in my 2-year tenure. And I wonder if that's something that I did. I actually think that I set a standard that was so high that the troops, i.e. the instructors and sort of that middle level leadership, interpreted my mission to be, physically, if this person can't do this, in the end, it's a basic course. It is one of the most grueling of all basic courses I would say it offered in the military is basic infantry training, because it's all dismounted, focused, as you know, et cetera. And it's 12 weeks of torture. But it still should be achievable for people who have been recruited into sort of that world that have been deemed having, those skill sets to at least have the potential to do so. And I know that we at least had 2 to 3 dozen female privates come through the gates, and I don't even know where they all ended up. And when I think about that, I wonder, did I really guide that issue the way it should have been done from a leadership point of view? And I'd probably give myself a failing grade looking backwards. And I don't know if it's because I was a big, believer when as I moved through the institution, and I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time as an instructor and then within that training system, that there should be one standard, but that doesn't mean the standard we have is necessarily the right standard for what's needed today. And I'm not saying standards are lower or higher. I just think that we just haven't had a good look at how we weave that problem back to some sort of level solution.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, obviously. What would I say? So I think the only thing that we can guarantee, and I'll probably change my mind on this as I talk, but let me just say, maybe the main thing that we should be focusing on guaranteeing is an environment where everyone can be respected and achieve their best self.
Right.
I think that should be the fundamental thing that we're focused on. Every time we take a step away, now, every time we layer something on top of that, because you use the term fair. Fair is such a difficult thing to.
Yeah, it's a fair comment.
It is.
Fair is a tricky word. You're right.
Because now you're talking about, if you're talking about standards, I think that's a great one, because we've all, whether it be in school, like a math test, or maybe something like English, which is a little bit more subjective, whether it be in high school or it be in the Army or whatever it is, we've all feel like we've been unfairly done in some way. And we definitely have. But I would say that when we start with that foundation again of respect, of everybody has the opportunity to achieve their best self, so that's the most important thing. Now, because when you then go from there, if that environment exists, now you're talking about standards and other things. Well, now you start getting into, like, what does right look like to you for what a QL3 should be? What does right look like to me for a QL3? It is very subjective. And so we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong. There's no doubt. Sometimes the candidate is the right fit and should have passed. Sometimes they're absolutely not the right fit.
I totally agree with your comment there.
So it's so complex. I think where we talk about, for those who haven't been in the military, selection and maintenance of the aim is something that's often referred to, and it's quite simply pick the most important thing and make sure that that's at the center of everything you do, because generally speaking, you're gonna get to the thing you want to get to if you stay focused on that which is most important. And I think in this, taking an incredibly complex subject, I think in this situation, if we focus on the treatment of people, the environment in which people can be their best self, and maybe your best self isn't going to get it done, but as long as you had the opportunity, right? So we look at any sort of selection in the military, right? Pilot selection, we talked about, special forces, right? These sorts of things. So even on like my best day, I would never pass aircrew selection. Doesn't matter how fit I got, anything. I would never pass aircrew selection. Is that fair? I think it is fair. What would not be fair is if the environment was not such where I could leverage everything I've got in me to try and achieve that which I put my mind to. So it's
that's
tough.
I agree. It's fair is a vague word, like saying I'm fine. It's like okay. It doesn't have a lot of meat or substance. But I just think that when we look at how we manage really any new recruit, it should always be everyone starts at that same line of departure in their career.
Agreed.
And I don't think there should be anything that should derail it based on gender ever. And honestly, I follow a lot of various initiatives within social media platforms, etc. And I'm really getting a different perspective on just how important it is for sort of a more immediate solution to that level of respect, like we talked about. That word respect means so much, and that is a word that has a lot of substance to it. But I don't think a lot of people expect it. And it could be, the new platoon commander in a battalion, it's like it really can be an intimidating environment. And I think that it comes down to credibility. It comes down to a little bit of retraining on what is appropriate type urban myth, to tell new recruits, like, it's ridiculous to know that the sort of things that we were told during our tenure in training, which is, at the end of sort of the airborne era, and a lot of these were, instructors had that experience and stuff in life. Those same stories from 1993 are being told in basic training courses in 2024. That is not progress. And that's what I just think that it becomes a male problem if we're constantly incapable of shifting a culture wherein, we do see, everyone, the diversity within the military, be it a gender issue or anything else, as a good problem. Like, some of the best militaries I respect having worked with in the military, like the Kiwis, for example, or the Aussies, like they are, or the, even I won't say like that, but the Dutch, I worked on the cusp of working with them. It's completely integrated, to the point of it's so normal that, and that's, I had very, limited exposure to those militaries, but I just thought, why are we so, what are the roadblocks for us getting to that type of mentality? And I would wish, I used to call a lot of my troops by their nicknames and their first names. And I used to get in a lot of trouble from my senior NCOs and warrant officers for that. But, if we had more of a soft mentality and treated people more like they were humans, I know that there's, like, you're talking to a person that people would laugh at, knowing that I'm saying this now, knowing how I was when I served, because I cold coffee in the morning just to make me angry kind of deal. But looking back, I don't know, my story. Halfway through my tenure as commanding officer, I hit that proverbial wall. Like, I collapsed like a bad bag of potatoes, just boom. And so for the latter part of my tenure as commanding officer, I had been to treatment for 2 months in Guelph, Ontario, and I'd come back and my whole mindset as a leader had changed 100%. And so how I treated people in my last 3.5 months of command was the way I wish I had treated people the first 24 years of my life. And that is a regret that I live with, is that valuing people for what they bring to a team, knowing that everyone brings their strengths, like they bring their baggage, their weakness, their problems of the day. But to manage that is a privilege, and we know command is a privilege. And, I thank General McQuillan for having given me that offer back in the day, General Carl, and because he had been, you talk about mentors, he was more of a distant mentor, but he always had interest in that I was making my way up the right path, albeit I had to hit a few walls to be, like the way I play hockey, I use the boards to guide me. That's the kind of way that my career was sometimes. I was kind of just following the board all the way around. So sometimes my journey was a bit longer because it was self-imposed, that those obstacles. But, I don't want to stray away, and we can, talk about the issue of the sexual misconduct within the military and sort of the extremes of that, the predatory type culture, and is it fair for females coming in from the get-go, and do they get groomed in a weird way to, have, a story or a narrative that, fits an institution. I think the institution needs to evolve. I don't think any institution like a military can say it doesn't. I think we can talk about our decades of service combined and think, the good things that changed and things that we like the way they are, because some things do work. And I'm not talking specifically to the gender issue or anything. I'm talking about, I used to joke about this down helicopter scenario in training in Fort Irwin in the U.S. and how ridiculous that we'd spent 5 days doing it. And then I crashed in a helicopter and realized how important it was to have done it. So it's just one of those things, right? You just don't know until you know. And we did it like clockwork that day in Afghanistan. So saved lives. So it is an interesting thing to have a career that was, very passionate to, us. I think you were really good at what you did. I think I was good, from what I did from an armor sense. And leadership is something that grows in more of a broader, view, because we become generalists the further we move on in life, and we're not, worrying about a crew or a troop or a squadron, worried about like a whole wing of the military, like you did for procurement in the Army, etc. I think it's important as veterans to still tell our story, but to know that it's important for those that are active service members to have the support of the veteran community when it comes to these sticky issues, like the problems we have with gender still to this day, in my opinion. And I don't think it's something that's going to be changed overnight. I think like anything, I'm not saying it needs to be a slow burn as as something that shifts, but I think we just have to do a better job at, setting a baseline for people when they join to feel that respect and safety to go through their career, that if something looks wrong, the button to make that known to other people is not difficult or shielded by anybody who could be harmed in the process, because that's how these monsters grow, in my opinion, right? Is that then they've either controlled the information or the narrative, or had the influence to have that person almost made to be, not believable, and
or too fearful to say anything.
Too fearful to say anything for risk of how that would look like in what is a career, right? Mm-hmm. It's not somewhere where you go and it's an 8 to 5 and you forget about it. You take off your smock and you go home. And I don't mock people that do those jobs. Sometimes I love the simplicity of not bringing work home, where you and I know when we worked, our brains worked at least 24/7.
Yeah.
I was, being leashed to sort of technology is one thing, but thinking about a problem constantly, that wicked problem doesn't have a solution. I think that most leaders in the military, and senior soldiers, as they get up that leadership into leadership roles, there's always something to do, right? It's like, it's like anything in your life. It's just, there's constant maintenance, as you say. And there's just shifting priorities in our lives, as our children get older and they're looking, to get out and go to university and get their first home, realizing how daunting that is for children that we have nowadays, So I just think that there are certain things that I look back at. I think about the mental health and how we manage leaders that have mental health issues come up, because a lot of things can be fixed with early intervention. That is my experience as well. You can't necessarily limit exposure to a trauma, but you can limit exposure to things that make your trauma worse, like an institutional failing. There's a lot of focus on, moral injury and that concept of institutional failure. Well, it's so prominent now, I would recommend within the veteran community, even within Veterans Affairs and how they manage veterans. And we can talk about Veterans Affairs if you want, but a lot of the veterans that I know that are struggling the most are struggling with how they're being treated by Veterans Affairs now, not how they were treated in the military per se. Having said that, there are a lot of leadership scars, right? Like there are a lot of people who have been damaged more by the leaders they had within any, X organization as they were in combat or an accident or you name it,
Yeah.
And I think it's something that needs, you can only put so much on every military course, and you can only add so many modules of this training and this online course and this and that. And you can only make a checklist officer good to a certain point. They can have all those checks in the boxes for how to manage money and how to, not have an environment that is not, open to, you can do all those programs online, but it comes down to that person, like we said, being a good person and being able to balance it all.
Why don't we start the discussion about mental health, about Veterans Affairs, go down there, but let's start with, where you found yourself at, like when you retired, when you left the forces, just to give the listener a bit of a sense of what was the impetus for you leaving. And I think that'll be a good way to then sort of roll into some discussions about mental health, about Veterans Affairs, and some other things that'll be, I think, quite useful.
Okay. Well, as I had mentioned, a bit earlier, so I was in command. I was in Meaford. As you know, you were within the division at that time as the chief of staff. So it was 2016. Throughout the process of the year of training, I had received this message, and I have no shame in explaining the background on this, from a friend back home. I come from a very small fishing community in Cape Breton, as I mentioned. So, 1,000 people, maybe coast, from one end of town to the other end. And, she said, my son Andrew has joined the military, infantry, and, can you please take care of him? Which is kind of, back home, like we think the military is so small that, everyone, my Uncle John, yeah, he's here. Well, that kind of idea. So all I just kind of said was, I didn't make any empty promises. I said, if he comes my way, I will certainly, give you an update, and I didn't think much more about it. So Andrew went off and did basic training in Saint-Jean, Quebec. And sure as it worked out, the triage between the various battle schools within Canada ended up coming up the hill in Meaford. So one morning I showed up for my normal morning sort of back brief, as we call them, prayers, which has a religious undertone, I guess, but that sort of meeting of minds, as you know, and I got the list of new recruits, and Private Fitzgerald was on it. So that's kind of the background of Andrew coming to the base. He managed to make it through the DP1 training. Like I said it earlier, it was really grueling. Those courses were meant to sort of test a lot of underlying basic tenets of being an infantry soldier. And it's all in a dismounted sort of purview because it's cheaper for training, et cetera. And we add this sort of mounted piece when they move off to unit life. I would say Andrew was a gray man in the sense that he went through his program. He didn't stand out as sort of like top candidate from the get-go, which is no good or bad. Nor was he in the failing sort of number of students that were needing extra, traces and exercises to see if they could test, et cetera, so they could sort of pass to that minimal standard. He actually, on his graduation parade, was noted for his marksmanship, which he got top marksman for his cohort. The tragedy of his story really, I think, started before he even came to Meaford, which I found out about later. The night he graduated, he never came back to the base. And so with that, the following day, it was a pretty huge celebration on the base. There was a lot of graduating courses. It was the end of summer training, which is a huge push for the instructor cadre within Ontario, not just within Meaford. And it was brought to my attention while I was discussing things with the division commander at the time that there was a private who was missing, and I found out that it was Andrew. We moved into sort of a state of normal SOP, standard operating procedure of what we do when a troop doesn't show up. So
Right.
The first time in a battle school, a troop doesn't show up the following day, especially after graduation. And the end result was that we moved forward to Owen Sound as his last known area, which is enough of the information we could get out of his peers, who were all bound for Gagetown, New Brunswick at the time, on a bus, waiting to depart. So the following 6 days we spent looking for Andrew with his parents, who were present from Cape Breton because they'd been there for his graduation ceremony. It became very apparent to me that we weren't necessarily going to find him the way I had hoped. The process of looking for Andrew, this is very difficult for me. When I think about how it made me reflect and fast forward on my own life, it was very difficult. I didn't have any problems, and I was certainly, I think, open to the role I had to play in managing like the media, both in French and English, and the local police and the OPP search team, et cetera, and my own troops, because it was an all hands on deck kind of search. We covered over 4,000 kilometers in steps within Owen Sound in that 6 days. If that gives you any idea of just every square inch of Owen Sound was covered. And then when we found him on the 6th day, he was near the water treatment plant in Georgian Bay, just off the Owen Sound coast. So, it was a very, very difficult period for people that worked for me, but also for me personally, because it sort of tied back a lot of sort of how I felt about my service to where I grew up and when I left and how I ended my career. And for me, that was the defining moment in me, like losing any sort of scope of wellness that I had managed to maintain to that point. Because, I did my master's paper back, when I did my staff college years, just after I came back as officer commanding of reconnaissance in 2010, on the growing problem of PTSD within the Afghan veteran community and how it would become a very serious issue. But really, I was kind of unknowingly, predicting my own fate as it would be, because I suppressed through a series of aggressive numbing mechanisms from 2010, really 2006, I think I really started to get sick, because I was on 306 as a staff officer and lost a couple of really close friends. And I think that kind of got me in this mindset of wanting to go back, which ironically I would still do today, which is a completely another issue. So for me, I know that once I came back from Afghanistan, shortly, the last time, then I shortly thereafter lost my mother to cancer. You fast forward 3 years from her departure, and then we lose Andrew. A lot of things were really starting to settle hard in how I managed my overall wellness. And I talked about numbing earlier, and the reason why I mentioned that, I almost named my book called Getting to Numb, because I think it's a real major issue within the veteran community to look for just something else that's going to be sort of chemical solution to their pain. And for me, for most it's alcohol. I struggle with alcohol. For a lot of people, it's now marijuana or cannabis, be it medical or otherwise. For others, it's even it's pharmaceuticals and things that, whether they're prescribed or not. So even as an active member, I had like a chronic issue with my back, and was able to access oxycodone. And some of my happiest memories in the military managing things were because I was medicated to the point of not feeling my emotional anguish and mental sort of distress, in addition to physical issues, right? And I think that, a lot of my, people I'm trying to help now, or folks I've worked with on various programs as a peer support worker for veterans on mental health programs like VTN, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we all have in common is that struggle with that numbing, making it want to go away without actually, looking at it right in the face and dealing with it. I can give you an example of, within my life now, my wife, Kelly, as you know her, there's certain issues we have to manage as sort of a melting pot family. Kelly has 3 children. I have 4, they're not in the same location. Those hard issues, I find, with my mental health journey, it's more important for me now. And I realize that, and I'm not saying this is something that, it's always been the case. I've recently realized how important it is just to get to the bottom of those right away. And there's so much stigma attached to how people get to that place of recovery, that deep rest, that reset. And I know that for some veterans, it's an embarrassing ask. They don't want to put their hand up and say I need to dry out, or I struggle with this one experience, be it a traumatic event from anything, a fire, an accident, an IED, combat, or like we were talking about earlier, sexual assault. How that gets managed in someone's mind and how that festers when you retire. I used to use people used to say, "Oh, go to a training institution to rest, to get ready to come back to the field force." But that most of the broken people, and I use that term very loosely, and because I'm very near and dear to my heart, but people who have injuries are people who are given time to think about their health, which generally is when you're not in an op tempo type go, and you're you're an 8 to 4 instructor at this school. Oh, by the way, take care of yourself. Well, it's something we tell people in one ear, but really we don't want that. That's not what we're expecting of them, right? We still have these high demands of them and their time. I think I worked longer hours as an instructor than I ever did in the field force, because you have a very strict, as set of mission goals and, aims and things that are, deliverables with
standards.
And outside of that, there are no expectations if you're not deployed. Yes, there might be a call for an ice storm or some sort of domestic crisis. I get it. There's always that possibility, but life is pretty good in the unit. I think I loved unit life personally, and I think that's why I sometimes regret having gone the NCM route, because I probably would have liked being more in the regiment than bouncing around, because when I did, it would have been more scripted. It would have been just to be an instructor, because staff is staff. Like I said, it's more of a general skill set you develop. You're either organized, you're disorganized. You can communicate in languages, both official languages or not. You can write your own language or not. We've seen them good and bad. But is it why we join the military? No one joins the military to be a staff officer, right? And if they did, I'd really reconsider why they're joining that person for the military, because it's a really kind of weird thing to want it to be. So, but yeah, so just going back to for me, I was given at least the caring hands of people who work for me, were helping me transition. The problem with anything I think in the military, and we've talked about this before, is we're really good at institutionalizing people, but there's absolutely no program deinstitutionalize, no deprogram.
Right.
And what does that look like? It looks different for everybody. So I understand that can't be a pan solution for everyone. A general officer who's been invested all these sort of, skills for, management, we'll say, because there's a certain level of leadership and then it becomes more managerial, political or otherwise, they get sort of set in a certain way, just like we have a soldier who's, a technician of a very specific, radio system that, they'll never find outside of the military, we program not just skill sets, but we also program a culture and a mindset that we don't tell people it's not going to quite work in the real world, i.e. the civilian world, when you lose your mind in Service Ontario, right? Because you think that they owe you a service, it still comes down to being a good person, right? And so I think there's a certain level of frustration within the veteran community about, I don't know if it was being fairly warned or given the skill sets to know that transition is going to be difficult and it's different for everyone. And some people go in and it's like they were made to transition. That was just like it was a flash in the pan, their life in the military. They always planned a life after the military. I can say I thought I'd be in the military forever.
Right.
And it was a mental health derailment. I even think today, would I be a useful officer if I was recruited today, even if it was at the same rank to do a staff job that I could do well? Probably. Do I want to do that? No. I love my routine, as you know now, and it is a privilege, I think, as well. I wouldn't say an honor. It's a privilege because it's something I think we earn as veterans to be as well taken care of when things are working right by Veterans Affairs than some of our peer nations. You can look at any nightmare on the internet about the U.S. Veterans Affairs and how people are literally left to die on the steps of some of those buildings. I don't think we're quite to that level of dysfunction with our Veterans Affairs. I do think it's a culture of no, and I think there's a lot of things that can be cleaner. And I think an indication of that is a number of civilian organizations that are popping up trying to just unmuddle the sort of bureaucratic process that exists for very basic things for veterans, be it a disability award, an allowance. So there are companies, most of them are veteran-based companies that are smart. They see a need where they're popping up willing to do just the basic paperwork that used to be done by, transition centers and service officers within the Royal Canadian Legion, et cetera. Those people are still out there, but people want answers fast. They want things settled fast. Well, there's a language within this world, which is an unfortunate, it's not a language that's, common to all, as we used to say. It is not a common to all language. I think I'm getting good at navigating those waters based on my life as a military officer and as a staff officer, because it's very policy-driven wordology. And I think it's unfair to expect, the average, and it doesn't matter the rank. We'll say, a Sergeant X, is that what we invested in that person for a skill set, was how to navigate a really convoluted insurance plan to access a benefit for an injury that's already been documented, and or not. That's the other thing. I was such a terrible officer with CF-98s and all those other things that were meant to take for the welfare of
those
soldiers.
Injury reports,
all these sort of numbered, I used to get that and just go, oh, why do I have to do this? Now I realize what it means to those troops for their, their pensionable sort of injuries and service-related injuries, I guess is a better way of coining it. And I know that the prevalence and the sort of number of these companies that are growing across this country are indicative of how frustrated veterans are with not necessarily the end state, but the process to get there is it's arduous, right?
So I hadn't actually thought of it this way. Something you said, I think is really really important, and it's the frustration that the veteran community has with how difficult transition is, and maybe it's useful to frame this in a way of operations. So you wouldn't give a list, because that's really what it is now. I mean, the resources out there for transition, there's online stuff, there's a manual, you've got a transition advisor if you want to use him or her, whatever. But really a lot of it is self-driven.
It absolutely is it's a self-education process.
Self-education.
It is.
It's a great way to put it. So if you went to an operation to, country X and the military listed out all the things you had to do before then, they don't let you self-drive that. They don't let you, like, you are put through your pace to confirm that you are ready to step into
You
that
fit in that
environment.
cog where you fit to make that machine work.
Right. I haven't made this observation in this way before, but I think they're linked. Is that why are we allowing people to leave into the next operational environment and just letting them self-study? And especially the people who I would say are the most vulnerable in transition are probably not in the position to be able to do that self-study, because it's a lot of policy. There's a lot of things that require sort of digging and reading between the lines. So the way you framed it in terms of, that feeling of frustration, it seems to me could be really analogous to preparing for an operation. We really need to have a hands-on approach to be able to prepare people for their transition. Because
I totally agree.
throwing a manual at them is just not going to do it.
I also think that, there's a lot of ways we could discuss this, but there are a lot of, aspects to being in the military where there's certain people who do certain things. And I'll give you an example of a clerk in general. It's a purple trade, i.e. it serves all branches of the military and the special forces. Well, a lot of people within the military know that the expertise for policies and administration are those clerks. When we get out, like you said, we're going from having our role, and I was this person within this posting, and I was supposed to do this, to you're essentially doing a whole team's effort for yourself, not having the expertise in the various, be it in the written word or how to manage the internet, because everything's done in my VAC account, which I get it. There's a whole level of security required. There's like a whole level of information being shared about your person, about your, so the confidentiality stuff. But it means there's always a layer of separation, right? You need to make these messages, and I'm sure you're familiar with the platform. It's not immediate. You can't call someone,
right?
And that level of, the unpersonal sort of feeling that people get of not having that, like, it's not even immediate access. It's the knowledge. Like I have my daughter who's 17, she's medically complex, but she's very trusting of people who are professionals. So I have this story I say, where she was taking a prescription the wrong way one day. And rather than listen to me say, no, you're only supposed to take this much, I had to get in my truck and drive to the end of the street, sit in it for 5 minutes, and come back and say, I just come from the pharmacist. And the pharmacist said it's supposed to be one. And she said, oh, well, if he said it's only one, then why am I taking it two? Right? That level of trust that we have, there's just no one to go to for language, for it's math right now. It's like, and I hate math. I absolutely hate it. But when you start going from one paycheck, one sort of meat and potatoes, here's your paycheck every 2 weeks, the same day, right? 15th and 31st or whatever it lands, to 4 different payers, 3 of which are insurance companies, the other being Veterans Affairs and or your pension. Like they're taxed differently, each of those envelopes. Most people don't think of taxes. They're in this bracket their whole life. They assume they're in that bracket. But now you have 4 different envelopes being taxed differently. Veterans don't get prepared for that stuff. Imagine being someone who struggles with mental health. They're released from the military with a medical pension, but then maybe they didn't have a full pension. Maybe they're only getting a portion of that. And then they don't pay attention to simple things like tax removal. At the end of the year, pay $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000.
Right.
Like that is like the slap. It's like when you're already injured and salt in the wound.
It's another rock.
And then it creates animosity. And then you have these groups that grow out of like pure hatred for, a system that if you do the right steps, it will take care of you. Like Kelly, my wife, points out, like we've been well taken care of by Veterans Affairs. The process to get to that level of finality for certain aspects was torture. And it's because I'm good with paperwork that I was. I also know that I was privileged in my rank and position when I completed my tour as a commanding officer. I went to the transition center as the previous commanding officer. I know I was treated differently than troops. I know the way I got access to my in residential programs at Homewood, both not once but twice. That's 4 months of intense therapy. That costs an average civilian over $30,000 for one program. So you think about it, like the military put me through almost $70,000 of in-residency programming. And I think it was because of my rank and because of the fuss I made when I realized I was really not well. And I don't think that sort of being your best advocate, that whole thing we talk about people, you're your own best career manager, all that kind of stuff that we think is almost like a flippant comment. But when you get injured, you are your own best advocate. Like, and it's like if your child was injured or had like a learning disability, but the university continues to test them in a room for thousands of people and they have this sort of whatever it is. Like, I do believe that we have to be more flexible in how we manage that. Just like if we don't have those skill sets in place within Veterans Affairs or organizations that work for them, and I'm telling you, that's also another can of worms, like PCVRS and this other organization that work with people during rehabilitation. I am not part of that. But I know that people are extremely frustrated. So it's not, even solutions to try to fix the problem in the interim are probably creating more frustration because it's become almost automated. The system doesn't have anybody on the other end that actually has some compassion.
Right.
Like the adjudication of these things is being done by black and white. There's a critical injury benefit it's out there. For all intents and purposes, if you lost a limb, it was created for that. But in 2019, one of the soldiers who was a soldier out in the eastern part of Canada got one for mental health. And then it's been a mass sort of, number of applications for it because of that sort of precedent.
Right.
But then none have been approved since then. It's 5 years ago.
Really?
It's a major issue.
Oh, okay.
And it's the irony of it all is it's a one-time payout. I think it's up to it's an $87,000 payout. And it's got to be linked, but it's all in the wording of a policy which probably hasn't changed in 50 years, right? It's uses words like immediacy. Well, anyone who knows anything about mental health know that PTSD is, if it's immediate, it's not chronic, it's acute. It's like it's shock from being in a car accident. That is like immediate onset of trauma. But chronic trauma usually festers weeks, months, years, decades later. Hence the number of people who are still coming forward with, PTSD from time in the Balkans, or, you name it. There are people who were Vietnam veterans who are now just, it's a memory thing. It's how we age. It's how our brain ages. It's where it's stored in your brain. It's centers that get blocked off because people cope with things differently. The brain, we know more about space than we know about the human brain. And therefore, we don't know much about mental health. And that's why whenever I find someone in my travels or a therapist that just knows enough, then explain it to me in layman's terms, those are the people I want to learn from. And then I try to help other people understand their injuries, at least.
So this is one of my new favorite questions in the last few podcasts, just because we're in election season, right? We have an election coming up in the U.S. Who knows when we're going to have an election here? There's elections going on left, right, and center around the world and the country in the next 12 to 24 months. Okay, Veterans Affairs. So if you were going to be giving any sort of advice, or if you could have be advising the major political parties here in Canada, the federal parties, because it's a federal issue, about veterans issues, what are the sort of the one or two things that you would look at and say, okay, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Singh, whoever, right? These are the things that you need to be aware of, and here's what you need to fix.
When I look at veteran issues, and, the first thing I look at is the military family. So people assume, that the military family is only when an in-service issue. The military family, when that person becomes now a veteran, mom or dad or whoever is in the family, is that military person, it's like it goes from having relatively decent social supports, a little bit of understanding of a common base and on military basis, et cetera, a common theme of that whole moving around a lot, children changing schools, like a general understanding to, depending on where someone retires, little to no understanding, including no family doctor, no focus to educational efforts, depending if they relocate to where they sort of recruited from. If you move from being in Ontario to rural Maritimes, name the town, will you have the same supports, that you had while in the military? And it's not always about support, but it's also about, it's about basic services, like basic transitional sort of supports, like how someone, for example, gets out with a medical issue. And we'll say it's a mental health issue because those tend to be harder to qualify, harder to say are fixed because it's more of a shift in how someone's wellness is. Vice a broken arm, it heals, you do some physio, you're good to go. Right. So I just think that military families are the focus of a lot of discussion. But if you look at, and I'm not even really smart on the issue of homelessness or military housing or any of that stuff, but I do know that there are veterans who struggle daily and go to food banks. And I think that's ridiculous. I know it can be a very at the same time, it's also a lucrative profession in the sense that, if you are good with, you manage things well, like financially as a family, you don't buy fancy new cars after every tour, those kind of things. You're relatively set in a certain way. I mean, you should get by, but there are certain centers that draw harder on people's financial sort of requirements, be it like, a city center like Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal, whatever. So military families, when I think about veterans, they kind of get lost because you go from even at the Army sense of being in a regimental family. You go to dinners twice a year. You get to see the people that you grew up with, kind of speak, as families. Well, depending on where a veteran is in their mindset when they retire, some people want nothing to do with that. So they make a decision for their entire family to divorce that part of their lives out. Right. So no more mess dinners, no more family days, no more, regimental, Christmas parties, all the things that draw people closer together, whether they move away from it or they're physically present, but don't want to be, confused, in that sort of retired versus not retired role and what that looks like and who talks to you and who doesn't talk to you and all those weird dynamics we have when we retire. The families tend to get missed, I think, in all of that, especially when it comes to, I gave you the example of, kids within my family who are getting help just to sort of better manage life and it's mental health focused. I don't think a lot of families know that those services are out there. A lot of those are paid services, especially if someone has a service-related, for example, PTSD, and that's service-related. Like Veterans Affairs, i.e. Medivie Blue Cross, will pay for every family member because it's their service-related injury, which it's proven affect families, right?
Yeah.
PTSD is not an isolated thing. Like people don't go to bed and someone breaks down with PTSD symptoms. Like they suffer that torture every day of dealing with a brooding father or mother or someone who has anger issues or is numbing constantly. So they see a father or mother who's constantly drinking alcohol or smoking marijuana and smelling, like a skunk coming in the house and trying to understand when they went from being this noble, go to work every day with a really good haircut and, things were good and to someone who struggles to sort of manage their day in a sort of productive way that most adults should. So families, I think, get tied up in the mess, especially if it's not a clean retirement. And I don't know how many people have clean retirements. I don't even know what that means when I say it. I think there are fewer people that transition where families aren't affected by their shift in life, unless they've done like a crazy amount of service and people are like begging them just to like move on because they're a grandfather or grandmother now. But I think that transition, depending on where the veteran is in their mindset, can really affect families. The second thing that's near and dear to my heart is suicide. The veteran suicide problem, and I don't ever quote statistics that don't relate to our sort of demographic in Canada, but it is a problem. And I know it's a problem because I manage it almost on a weekly basis. And I say that it's either I know someone whose friend or brother or sister in arms has committed or attempted suicide, or I'm the person that's doing that intervention with someone who is suicidal. And even the concept of suicide ideation, where someone, I tried to explain this at a concert called Stomp the Bruce. We just recently ran near Wyerton for with the intent to raise some money for a veteran respite. And it's, the suicide problem, people see it as like a checking out, like, not managing your problems, but it's from deep-seated shame and guilt that sometimes is hardwired in people, may or may not have been a military thing that was programmed in them, but it's not wanting to exist. And I think that when people say like it's horrific, it is horrific. Suicide, I've lost so many people to suicide. My driver who was killed in Afghanistan from an IED was replaced by a driver who, when we got home, killed himself in his storage container when I was in staff college, like 6 months after we got back. And honestly, his whole, and that's one of many people in my life who've committed suicide militarily. And now it extends to some of my civilian friends. But I know that the issue of a suicide type mindset, or even like veterans being offered like assisted death because they're so complex in how they need help, that, we've had instances, and I know they're few and far between because I know Veterans Affairs is going to get really excited if they would hear this, but it did happen to veterans I know where they were offered assisted death because their mental health is so complex that like the people who are trying to manage their file they're not professionals in that field, but they're the ones that are managing complex issues. So suicide is closely linked as well for me to homelessness. Like it absolutely breaks my heart to think that someone would serve their country from, 2-3 years to, several decades and fall so hard on times where they couldn't be refocused or reset in a path that at least gave them the basic things they need in life, like a shelter, like water, like food. I understand that some people create those lives themselves, but I would recommend that that is all a result of, in most circumstances, it's a result of, being that badly injured on various planes, moral, mental, emotional, and some of that is a choice. I get it. Some people say, well, it's a choice. It is and it isn't. And I think in Canada, especially with our weather and whatnot, you see the amount of homelessness we have in all these cities now. I personally have been keeping an eye on all the efforts that are going on in Kingston and Ottawa with these veteran villages and stuff. I'm also a big believer in small homes and in affordable housing and the fact that it's an epidemic worldwide, not just in Canada and not just for veterans. But I think that when you see someone that works so hard, or didn't, but I guess it comes down to those basic tenets of care, and do people need big payouts for everything? And do people, I think that there is a balance to be struck with all that, because we don't want to incentivize medical retirement either. If people realize that, there's certain benefits which are tax-free and you start adding it up and, honestly, say for a person arguably makes, $6,000 a month clear, but knows medically they can make $6,200 clear to sit at home. I'm not saying that is a major issue, but it's always going to be an issue.
Oh, yeah.
And that is enough to ruin it for those people that are fighting hard for their back claim because they were a trucker their whole life. I have a friend who was a trucker, Newfie, he's been across this country a million times with tanks on the float, you name it. And you can see him getting smaller every time I see him. His back is literally degenerating. Still can't get a basic claim through. And to me, it's a criminal in a sense that why is something so obvious, so hard? Why isn't there a center as big as this that has a trained professional, medical professional, so a nurse or a doctor, and then the same thing in the mental health realm. They do a quick assessment. You fill out a few DSM-5 forms if it's a mental health thing. You get a litmus test to where this person should be. You reorient to a professional for, I was sent to a couple different psychiatrists to get a solid, more defined view of what my actual issues was. Because as you know, trauma or operational stress injury, we have different names for it. And it's had different names, as you know, over history. It really is. It's a sort of grouping of, mine is cumulative. And I know that Veterans Affairs hates the idea that it wasn't one thing that broke me. Well, it wasn't one thing that broke me. It was going hard into a face first into a storm, constantly ignoring the thing that was fueling you, which is, and still feeling like you were making success. I was a CEO, I was doing it. But, like I said, when I lost Andrew, it just, the wheels just came off. The whole, lab came to a halt because there was nothing, I wasn't taking care of the maintenance. I wasn't doing what I needed to do to myself to set myself for success, which links back to what I talked about earlier, taking somebody like yourself midstream, just before you go into your first job as a general officer within the Army, how important it would have been for you to even have a month reset, not even a 2-month. And what that looked like, I know that could open itself up to a real weird dynamic of, senior officers going on fishing trips and stuff like that. But I'm talking about a professionally run,
right?
Almost doing what people I went through, the Veterans Transition Network, which I said is a phenomenal program. And it's an individual based program and it's based on gender because people's trauma it can be gender based, but it can get weird if you mix them when it comes to discussing it. And it's like a reenactment type idea. And which is not accepted in all psychology realms when it comes to recovery, but it worked for me. Just thinking about, people will say, well, I've talked to people who finished as senior officers that have, meritorious, awards and whatnot that say they have no trauma. And I'm not saying I'm trying to create a culture where everyone has trauma, but I think everyone has demons. I think everyone could use a reset, even if it's a deep-seated, educational sort of, session that helps people appreciate the psyche or, what it looks like as you transition 10 years before you transition. So maybe you start thinking in an intelligent way what your next 10 years look like for your family and for the institution and for whatever it is that you're doing. But we don't ever think that deep into a problem. We just add and graph on more training to these individual training courses like the colleges that we have in the Army in Kingston and the one that's in Toronto. We add more and we take off things that are probably good things to have right? And we computerize everything, which takes out a human element. So we're constantly adding things, which waters down the importance of it, right? Like you said, you had me into brief at RMC. I think we did that 2 years, right?
Yeah, we did. It was a Bell Let's Talk event.
Yeah, and for me, it was about just letting them know, like, you can come out of the gates as fast as you want. There's different things and obstacles that are going to slow you down. And you might be the only person that slows you down. Yeah. And for me, I think and anyone who knows me well, like, Greg Mackay, those folks that you know as well, they'll always tell me, Christian, you've always been your worst enemy. Like, there's no other enemies in your world. Like, you are the person that criticizes yourself by far the most. Like, you're the most, in a way, I think it drove me. In other ways, it set me back, right? Because I'd be competitive with other people, like we mentioned. And that creates resentment, which creates dislike, which changes behavior, right? And then you have these social atoms that we develop, whether they're false or not in the military, of like peer groups that are not healthy. And they lead to, like I said, like things happening, and I don't like that culture. That's why I always thought if we could have that more of a first name, like soft mentality, but we're not mature enough to do that as a military. People still need to be told, like, you do this, I do that.
I think one of the most telling things when you came to RMC, as powerful as your talks were, and they were certainly powerful, it was after the talk, after the keynote, the lineup of officer cadets, like sitting there waiting to have a chat with you about something. And the only reason I think that it even dissipated is that they have classes to get to. Right? But that to me was, I think, really instructive, and just sort of sitting back and watching this going, okay, that's really interesting. Like, this has struck a chord. This has really resonated that everybody's got something that they're dealing with.
Well, I think I know that when you were in that position as the director of cadets at the Royal Military College, it's one of those daunting positions where you want to do so much for that population within the military, so much. And we know from our own experience at that point, and certainly my goal when we came, like I mentioned, was not just to give them a bit of like that, sort of reality check, but also to say that it was okay. And I don't have to get in specifics, but I would say the vast majority of the students that lined up after the fact, they weren't. It was the other caveat here is it was third and fourth years, right?
So it was actually
only fourth years.
It might have only been fourth years. Yeah, that PD.
So what was really shocking to me and was the number of both men and women who would come forward with the questions they had were always linked to. Almost always linked to their welfare. Like they felt like a certain thing that they needed to do, whether it was like a certain, an occupational transfer. We all struggle with what we're going to be when we grow up, kind of deal.
Yeah.
And I think many people don't get it right. And we can talk about what designs out there work, like where you go through a bunch of basic courses and then you get selected. But I think people struggle with that being, like you said, branded with, okay, you're a combat engineer, you're an armored officer, you're a Mars officer within the Navy, and not having ever been on a ship. Right. I can tell you, I probably would have been really ill if I was in the Navy. God. For as much as I like the idea of like sailing around the world, I don't like the idea of being sick the whole time. But I guess it's a lot of them just struggled with where they fit and where they would fit, because they were struggling with an issue. And some, it was, you had, I think within the military, again, going back to the suicide, some had lost, a friend at RMC to suicide, and they were still struggling with it and hadn't really got or received the level of treatment they need to sort of manage it and still, work within a military environment. And I think it's scary for, like, I remember having a lot of questions when I was at RMC and just being so bravado that I would never ask unless it came up by accident, and I'd mock the person who did ask it, but want to know the answer to the question.
Right.
Right. Because it's all about not being the person who sticks out. And I think that type of culture, I think it's kind of normal to have within sort of that sort of pointy edge of sort of occupations within our society, but it doesn't necessarily make it right all the time. And I think that's something, like, if I could sort of talk about your style, I think that's one of the things I always loved about when we worked together was I think you had that openness to people's concepts, ideas, like, and I was a lot more closed-minded, I think, until I realized how injured I was. And I think you had that sort of better step back. And it might have been sort of the analytical part of being a combat engineer and an engineer, by education. But I also think it's it's a testament to how you were as a leader. And I think a lot of leaders could learn, like, and that goes back to the mentoring thing, from just being able to see people that they should be more like, right? So even as peers, when we were in the Army staff, same rank at the time, like I learned more because you're post-command, I was pre-command. I hadn't even gone into that awesome stage of our, path in the military, and you had just come from it and you were a senior, I think that's another thing we don't allow ourselves to do, is to learn from other people, because it's like a bad thing. Like I don't, like taking the best of every leader, and I used to say that to a lot of the most brilliant officers that are out there, that were young officers waiting training and going to that, like not having a defined role because you're not trained yet. And one is the current serving officer of the Royal Canadian Dragoons, Chloe Summerfield, first female commanding officer of the Dragoons. I'm extremely proud of her. She's one of the best officers I've ever met, combat arms officer. But I know that there was a time when she was at the school, and it's a funny story because we just spoke about this, because I just sent her a history book about the regiment. Long story short, she kind of reflected on how painful that period was in her life, not having been fully trained and just being an officer without profile. The jokes we used to make about it, right? But I think, like, I harken back to my on-the-job training, which meant I didn't really have a role, was what helped me, at least in my first role, not stumble as much as I probably would have. It made me a lot more humble. Was I as humble as I think I should have been? No, but my cockiness was based on an insecurity about not speaking the language of the troops I was leading, which feigned when I became bilingual. And then I had this sort of cockiness from being bilingual and knowing that a lot of the people around me weren't. And that was an advantage to me, which actually eventually got me like a little bit of bad press with my own peers within an Anglo regiment, because they thought I had purposely gone this route to sort of get a leg up on them as you get through those sort of finite steps of becoming a major and then a colonel and then getting command, right? Which, but like I said, you could put, the joke is you could put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig in the end. And I just needed polish, and I was never getting it. So,
hey, I want to, because I made a note about this previously. So we talked a lot about veteran transition and a lot of the challenges. We'd be remiss, I think, if we didn't highlight some veterans that have transitioned exceptionally well. And you're an ambassador for one of those veterans now, at least his company.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's some, in fact, another veteran who I think has transitioned really, really well is going to be in that group. The Remembrance Day sort of 3 that I put out, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the veteran-owned company.
Sure. So Kevin LeBoeuf and his wife Alicia, they developed a company. He's like me. He's part of as you know, I'm very proud of my beard. It was part of my identity post-army, because in our army we shaved all the time. I know it's kind of changed, and I think it's smart that it's adjusting to norms of today. But so I grew this beard. I call it my recovery beard. But now it's like I have fears of waking up having had a recruit term moment and shaved my face, and those are very sad moments when I wake up thinking I shaved my beard. But so I stumbled sort of throughout the various platforms on the internet. I've been following various organizations that support support veterans or veterans, helping develop a post-military life. And Kevin is one of these folks. And so he has a business called Educated Beards. And the premise is that it's obviously super organic. There's no parabens. There's none of the things that are in a lot of the products that are out there. It's a huge industry, beards. But Educated Beards is a veteran-run company. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Veteran Company of the Year last year, or one of the entrepreneurial awards for veteran companies, based out of Fredericton, New Brunswick, but services, the better part of North America, has these ambassadors. So gentlemen like me, and they're not all men. I think he mentioned there are some ambassadors who are like barbers, et cetera, that are interested in knowing and being involved in the community, of, what it's like. And I know people can say it's trendy, but it's another group of peers that I feel connected with. And honestly, it's, we have wellness challenges, and we discuss transition and what it's like post-military, because almost all of them, if I'm not mistaken, are, there might be a couple of serving members. Most are retired veterans in Canada and the US, but also some first responders mixed in there.
Great.
And, all have a story. and marvelous mustaches and beards, and Guinness World Book record holders, etc.
Okay.
But what I like about it, it's the camaraderie. It's almost like having a mess life again, like a social atom, as I talked about. Now, as you know, my book, I call that the Blue Circle. Well, this is kind of a periphery. Like, it's obviously not my immediate family, but it's just a network of people that are like-minded. That it's not anything nefarious other than that. Kevin will seek our advice because we use his product. And as a result of using his product, we help support it when people ask, hey, and even when you see, you'll see like the average Canadian, and I spend a lot of time in the woods hunting, and I spend a lot of time in rural areas, and a lot of people think, rednecks don't take care of their beard. You would not believe the number of folks out there that take their beards very seriously, despite what your first blush might tell you of that person, and usually it's wrong anyway. And we all know that. So so educated beards, it's living the educated lifestyle is the sort of slogan, and I love it because it's like anything. I put some of my efforts behind Sound of Remembrance as an example, which is a concert in Ottawa on the 9th of November, being organized by Graham Trude, who is a veteran. He's another armor soul like me. He's got a very good story to tell because he was a soldier who did initial engagement, went to Afghanistan as a tanker, came back and was a law enforcement officer within various communities, including Northern Canada, and he's become a musician, but he's doing things for veterans. And that's where I put my weight, is behind the Kevins and the Grahams and the Mike Dobransky, who's another friend of mine who's, doing something more local to sort of the Grey Bruce area in Ontario, but it's all for veterans. A bigger scale, it's like the Veterans Transition Network or Can Praxis.
Right.
And then in my own sort of little bubble, I have that Warriors for Life effort where essentially I try to take the proceeds of the book I wrote and anything that I can sort of raise in that vein, and it goes right into an account exclusive for bursaries and names of fallen soldiers and first responders. It's a growing, I'm up to my third bursary. The first one, which was Andrew Fitzgerald's, has been given out 4 times. And then we have one for Jim Mitchell, who was a dragoon from Task Force 306, who was killed during an ambush with his sergeant, Craig Gillum, who I also knew, in Owen Sound. And the importance of that for the legacy of soldiers, for example, I give you an example of the Mitchells. Carol was the last existing person in her family. She lost her husband last year to cancer. She lost her second son a year after Jim was killed by an IED to cancer. And now she has a group of veterans within the Meaford area, the bike group that are there for veteran bike group that take care of her every year on the 3rd of October. They go to Mitchell Park, which is in Owen Sound. Like that kind of legacy, she gives out the award at the Owen Sound High School every fall to that graduate who best expresses sort of the tenets of a helping profession, not making it too exclusive. It doesn't have to be military. So those kind of efforts, I think, help veteran families. They help veterans have purpose. And like I said, sometimes I feel like I'm all over the place to sort of get more focus. I will write again. I think my next endeavor is going to be write about other people's stories, have other veterans help tell other people's stories. The number of people that want to do that just don't feel they have, the energy to do it, or even just to sit down and map it out. It's pretty phenomenal. I think, there's been a lot of people tell their story. I think there's so many stories that need to be told. It's not just about Afghan vets. It's about the search and rescue pilots. It's about, the corporal who broke their back parachuting, but was like a precision instrument until they were injured, because those stories, they kind of get lost in all the war, quote unquote, to misuse the term, porn of people's, escapades and the highlights of our combat, et cetera. There's a lot of low moments in those combat situations as well, where we lost people and made bad decisions. And I think it's good for people to be able to express, what the institution did for them and how it set them up for the lives they have now, good and bad. I know people also need a venue just to rant. And sometimes you can take a rant and make it a beautiful story because it's just their ability to express themselves in their own way. And I'd like to do that. I think that would help. Even if it's not something that's published, it's only ever just for your eyes only kind of deal, where someone can tell their story, put some pictures in there, a few receipts or leave passes so they can sort of have some memories. Then it becomes a legacy for their family too. And a lot of soldiers have a hard time talking about what they did, good or bad, because they feel like most of the people in their lives can't relate. And that too is something I try to navigate with what I do. And as a peer supporter, everyone's story is important. And I think, unfortunately, we don't want to hear some people's stories because it's some of the issues we spoke about earlier, like the sexual misconduct aspect. There's a lot of, for example, female soldiers that I've met who are injured that don't want their stories told because it's a black spot on their heart or soul. And it's not, it doesn't bring them pride. It brings them it's more injurious, but those stories need to be told because that's part of the human experience and being in the military, et cetera, right? It still is a human experience. Right? We can have all the AI and all the systems we want, calculate math for us. Leadership is a human experience and no one's perfect at it. And I would never say I was. I'd like to think I worked hard at trying to be average and sometimes failed to succeed.
Hey, Christian, before we close this off, I just want to see if there's anything that you want to leave with the listener before I thank you for your time.
I really appreciate the opportunity to have such a huge discussion about a lot of things that are really important. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we did move around a lot and, we sort of hit the wave tops of some major issues that are near and dear to both of our hearts. And I think most people in general who care about making, things better and living their best lives, there are certain things that I will continue to make myself smarter on when it comes to transition, because I do want to be that person who can speak with some authority about what the actual problems are and how they should be navigated. And then we danced around, sort of how things are being delegated to companies who can manage sort of the bureaucracy of, Veterans Affairs, if we use that example. But I think there are also there's a lot to be said about having a step back and looking at, is the organization completely failed? I don't think so. And I don't want anyone to leave here thinking I'm a pro or for or against, sort of where Veterans Affairs stands. Can things be better? Absolutely. And I don't think it's fair to use people's health in balance when they're trying to make things better. I think we just have to be smarter at problems that shouldn't be problems. And I use that example of the critical injury benefit. Does it mean that everyone should get it? I know there's a threshold for everything. But when I follow a lot of these online veteran groups that are seeking answers, and there's so many of them on social media. And I follow them more out of interest of knowing what the right answer is. And there's a couple of folks out there, a couple of probably previous experts in those worlds, like clerks and senior clerks, et cetera, that are speaking intelligently about what the actual answers are. But the fact that the answers are that hard to find, that's the problem. Like, you shouldn't have to take to social media as an anonymous post to figure out who's paying you what, right out of the gates when you retire. Like, it should be so well understood, at least the first bound of those few steps when you get out, that people shouldn't leave stumbling or afraid or numb so they don't have to manage it, which happens to a lot of, vets. They literally don't ever put things in play. Don't get their OHIP card if they're in Ontario. Don't look for a doctor, et cetera. So there's that. I also appreciate the fact that, we have the opportunity to look back, sort of as like the armchair general and say, this should be better in leadership training and this should be better here. It is a complex problem. And we both agree that the cultural issues with the military, it's not like it's not like an airplane you build in midair. That's not how it's going to be a lasting solution. I do think that they should be constantly looking on that, like how to improve that culture. And a simple example is those urban myths that are still told to basic trainees, and it doesn't matter what trade, that we had when we were in the early 90s that are still like legacy stories that really, well, I think that they make it really uncomfortable for people. We talked about that respect, talking about, I don't even have to give you any examples. It's always usually based in some sort of like sexual undertone. It makes people uncomfortable. It's just that there's no place for that kind of stuff, I think. I think we really have to clean our act up. People used to joke about the vulgarity and stuff. It's the professionalism and how we deliver things. And we set those conditions for people to have that safe and respectful environment. Is it having like, tons of different systems so people can like never feel, stress or, we know that there is an element that's important within the military training of it being a stressful environment and having different conditions in place to test. But should it be one where people, like I said, like it's an occupational hazard to be a certain gender? I think that is definitely something we need to turn a corner on as we go into 2025. Like, hands down. Like, I'll be 50 in the new year, and I can promise you, like, I hope my next 25 years I can say I'm proud of an institution because I really shifted in the right direction. It doesn't have to be hard and left-right turns. Maybe it's not a hard turn to start. I think that as you would probably agree with me, our peers who are serving today in senior capacities or whatever capacity they're doing the best they can, as fast as they can. And I think there's still problems within the rank and file. it's not something that's going to be solved overnight. And I really hope we put our best foot forward, because I want to still be proud of the institution and not distance myself from something that defined me the better part of my adult years. So I appreciate being here, Chris.
Thank you so much for taking the time, coming down and meeting me here in Waterloo. We've been friends for many years, and many more to come. And this was an important one that I wanted to do in person. I don't think that these issues can necessarily be tackled with the same level of emotion and authenticity over video. So the fact that we figured this out eventually and made it work, I really appreciate that. So thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your insights, and thank you for being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And I appreciate you for being on my healing journey. Again, one of those people within my blue circle, very near and dear to my heart. Like I say this to anyone who calls, whether I know them or I don't know them, the first thing I say is never doubt life. And like you have been in my life post-service to make me feel exactly that I should never doubt life. We all have a path, and it's about living your best life. So much appreciated. I appreciate it, my friend.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Christian. Please subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.